Welcome back to her Fireside Stories, where family secrets unfold by the crackling flames. Tonight we journey to Red Elk Canyon, where a Mother's Day photograph captured more than just smiles. When Margot Lindley followed her son and daughter-in-law to the canyon's edge, she never imagined the camera flash would be the last light she'd see. Betrayed and left for dead, this grandmother of three had just one hidden asset. They overlooked her wedding ring with an emergency feature that would turn her hunters into the hunted. Discover how one woman's preparedness transformed her from victim to victor in our most shocking true survival story. Yet, if this tale of unexpected danger and brilliant revenge intrigues you, hit subscribe now to join our growing Fireside family. I read every comment, so tell me, what would you do if someone you trusted led you to the edge? Grab your favorite blanket, silence your phone, and prepare yourself some family photos hide deadly intentions. Margot Lindley had grown fond of quiet mornings. At 65, she cherished the sunrise over her rustic cabin near Red Elk Canyon, letting the orange-pink glow wash across her weathered porch. She often sipped herbal tea in her faded rocking chair, savoring the hush before the world woke. Her days unfolded gently, feeding Scout, her loyal German shepherd, then tending the wildflowers out back. Since her husband's passing a decade ago, Margot had carved out a simple, solitary life as a widow. She'd once been a trail guide leading tourists across the jagged paths of Red Elk Canyon with sure-footed precision. Those days gave her a reverence for nature's power, a respect she never lost. Scout, with his soulful brown eyes, kept her company. Now, and in many ways, she felt they understood each other more deeply than words could say. Mother's Day was nearing, and Margot had spent the last few evenings poring over boxes of old photographs. She planned a special scrapbook for her son Bryce, capturing moments from his childhood, his first camping trip in those canyons, the fishing expedition where he'd caught a trout so small they'd let it go, the time he'd tried climbing the corral fence and ended up flat in the mud. Each photograph was a piece of their shared history, some sweet, some bittersweet. Though Bryce had grown distant over the years, moving to the city for a corporate job and returning only for the occasional holiday visit, Margot still felt a swell of pride flipping through the pictures. She held onto the hope that Mother's Day might rekindle the warmth they once had, though she tried not to cling to impossible dreams. Her morning was interrupted when she heard the crunch of gravel in her driveway. Unexpected visitor Scout pricked his ears, letting out a low rumble. He rarely barked, but she recognized the subtle warning. Gathering her worn cardigan around her shoulders, Margot peered out the window to see a sleek sedan parked near her aging pickup truck. Out stepped Bryce Lindley, tall and broad-shouldered at 38, with a bouquet of flowers in hand. At his side was Cassandra, his impeccably dressed wife. Margot felt a stutter of excitement in her chest. It wasn't often Bryce made surprise visits. The last time she'd seen Cassandra, it had been a tense Thanksgiving. Back then, Cassandra seemed uncomfortable in the rustic cabin, complaining of the chill or the creaking floorboards. Yet here they were, unannounced, wearing bright smiles. Bryce enveloped Margot in a hug, murmuring something about wanting to do better at staying in touch. Cassandra presented her with lilies and daisies, a swirl of color that made Margot's heart stir with a cautious joy. Then Bryce dropped his news. They had planned a special Mother's Day adventure, a chance to revisit Red Elk Overlook, the place Margot once guided hikers through. Despite Scout's sudden growl at Cassandra's approach, Margot brushed off any misgivings. She wanted to believe this was a genuine gesture of love. She could sense a shift in the air, but she told herself it was just the swirl of emotion. Maybe this was the moment they'd truly reconnect, a mother and son, bridging the distance between them. That afternoon, the three of them settled into Margot's living room, where the old fireplace stones bore decades of soot. Cassandra perched on the edge of the sofa, crossing her legs with perfect poise. Bryce, glancing around at shelves stacked with framed photos and dusty knickknacks, seemed eager to move the conversation along. He painted vivid pictures of Red Elk Overlook with grand gestures. Mom, you won't believe how the canyon looks this time of year. The storms have carved new layers into the rock. Cassandra's read all about it. She says, the wildflowers on the upper ridge are in full bloom. Cassandra smiled, nodded, and then cast a hesitant glance at Scout, who was perched protectively at Margot's feet. Margot felt a small flicker of warmth. Her son was talking about the canyon as if it were new and mysterious, while she already knew its secrets. She'd guided countless groups through the tight switchbacks across precarious ledges and up rugged trails. The canyon's jagged beauty was etched into her bones, a tapestry of red earth and hidden gullies. It was where she'd taught Bryce to respect nature. Of course, back then, he had bounded ahead with boyish enthusiasm, heedless of danger. Even after decades, Margot could recall the exact shape of certain rock formations, the best vantage points for sunrise, and where the hawks nested in early summer. As Bryce continued describing his plan, Margot listened carefully to Cassandra's occasional remarks. The younger woman kept emphasizing how perfect the location was for a family photo. Cassandra even mentioned hiring a drone to capture aerial shots. The mention of a drone unsettled Margot slightly. It felt so impersonal, but she let it pass. She was touched that they had put effort into orchestrating a special Mother's Day treat, especially given how rarely they visited Scout, however, seemed less convinced. While Bryce talked and Cassandra flashed her polite smile, Scout let out a soft whine, stepping closer to Margot's leg. Sometimes Margot teased that her dog could sense the soul of a person. Still, she told herself that tension was just leftover from that awkward Thanksgiving. Perhaps Scout remembered Cassandra's displeasure at the musty cabin, or the time she yelled at him for jumping too eagerly to greet her dogs, were creatures of memory after all. By late afternoon, they had agreed, early the next morning, they'd drive together to Red Elk Overlook, the highest vantage point in the canyon. Margot felt a swirl of anticipation, half excitement and half trepidation. She was no stranger to the risks of that terrain, especially for someone her age. But Bryce insisted he and Cassandra would help every step of the way. They had also brought harnesses and trekking poles. After so many quiet years, Margot found herself yearning for that once familiar sense of adventure. And if it brought her closer to her son, maybe it was worth whatever unsettled Scout. With the plan set, Cassandra complimented the cabin's rustic charm before they packed up to return to a hotel in town, promising to pick Margot up at dawn. Dawn broke over Red Elk Canyon with a shimmering light that slid across the desert brush and caught the edges of tall pines. True to their word, Bryce and Cassandra arrived at the cabin just as the sun was cresting the horizon. Scout hovered by the porch, ears alert, as Margot locked up and tested the door handle. She wore boots she hadn't touched in years, a warm flannel and a small backpack containing her camera water and a few snacks. Bryce hefted a sleek DSLR camera with multiple lenses, while Cassandra adjusted the strap of a high-tech drone case slung over her shoulder. They appeared eager, but also somewhat rushed, as if propelled by an urgency Margot couldn't place. Scout hopped into the back seat of the sedan, head sticking out the window as they made their way down dusty roads. The journey took them through winding lanes, across a narrow bridge spanning a shallow river, and finally up the switchbacks leading to the Red Elk Overlook parking area. Each bend offered fleeting glimpses of deep canyon walls and outcroppings of crimson stone. Margot felt a stirring in her chest. This canyon was part of her, and the sense of homecoming was profound. Once they parked, the group hiked the first mile with relative ease. Bryce helped carry some of Margot's things, and Cassandra walked a few steps behind. The morning air was crisp and golden light washed over them, creating a picturesque setting. Occasionally, Margot paused to point out a rare plant or mention a childhood memory of Bryce climbing boulders without fear. He would nod somewhat distant but still offered polite smiles in return. Cassandra seemed engrossed in her own thoughts, fiddling with her phone and the drone controller. The trail narrowed as they reached a well-known rocky outcrop that thrust like a ledge into the canyon. The vantage point offered a sweeping view of layered cliffs that glowed with coppery hues under the advancing sun. It was breathtaking, yet Margot felt a slight chill in her stomach. She wasn't afraid of heights. She had guided too many people here for that, but the silence from Bryce and Cassandra was disconcerting. She knelt briefly to stroke Scout's neck, feeling the dog's tense muscles. Bryce approached from behind, wearing a bright grin. Mom, let's take a family photo right here. Isn't this perfect? He gestured to the ledge, urging her toward the edge. Cassandra readied the DSLR, adjusting the zoom. Margot's instincts fluttered. Something about the way Bryce's hand lingered on her shoulder felt off, yet she swallowed her unease, chalking it up to nerves. This was Mother's Day after all. Why ruin a good moment with paranoia? She took a careful step back, aligning herself against the canyon backdrop. Cassandra peered through the lens, hair blowing in the wind. Then Bryce directed her again. One more step. Mom, the light's just perfect. Margot inched back cautiously, hearing pebbles skitter down the cliff. Cassandra's finger found the shutter release, and Margot forced a warm smile for the camera. Click, the flash caught her unprepared. In that brief second, she felt Bryce's hand tighten around her elbow. She thought he was steadying her. But as the flash subsided, there was an unmistakable force, an undeniable, deliberate shove between her shoulder blades. The world went sideways. Margot's feet lost their grip on the ledge's rough stone. She dropped backward with a startled yelp, arms flailing for anything to catch. She caught the stinging scent of Bryce's aftershave and the fleeting image of Cassandra's cold stare through the camera viewfinder. Time seemed to stretch, sound warping into a muted roar in her ears. Reflex took over. She lunged for the trunk of a twisted pine that clung to the rock face a few feet below the ledge. Her fingers snagged a gnarled root nail, scraping bark. Pain shot up her arm as she slammed against the canyon wall, but she'd stopped her plunge just barely. Her left ankle twisted badly on a rocky shelf, and she felt a sharp crack in her arm when it took the brunt of her fall. For a second, black spots danced across her vision, threatening to pull her into unconsciousness. She clung fiercely to the pine root breath, ragged heart slamming in her chest. Above her, Bryce and Cassandra peered down. She heard Cassandra's voice, curiously calm. She went all the way right, and Bryce's reply equally eerie in its calmness. Yes, she's gone. No one survives that drop. Their silhouettes lingered for just a moment, then withdrew from the edge. Margot realized they thought she was dead, that the rocky outcrop they stood on blocked their view of her partial landing spot. She struggled to breathe, each inhale a dull ache in her ribcage. She wanted to call out, to scream, but she couldn't force sound past her throat. Instead, she felt tears sting her eyes. They had come to kill her, her own son. She still couldn't believe it. Moments later, she heard Scout's frantic barking from above. The dog must have recognized something was terribly wrong. But Cassandra's shrill voice barked, "Quiet, you stupid mutt!" Then the barking faded, replaced by the sound of retreating footsteps. Margot lay there trembling, trying not to make any noise that might draw them back. She listened to the rustle of wind through junipers, the faint echo of Bryce's footsteps diminishing with distance. Pain radiated through her body, but she fought to keep her grip on that root. Slowly, carefully, she shuffled her good foot along a narrow shelf of rock, managing to wedge herself into a shallow crevice. Rocks tumbled below her, dropping into the vast emptiness of the canyon. She didn't want to look down. If she did, she might lose what little composure she had left. Her heart hammered as she thought of Bryce and Cassandra casually walking away, presumably heading back to the car, satisfied she was gone. She wondered if they'd take Scout or leave him. She wondered if they even cared. Hours blurred together as Margot clung to that steep ledge. Pain throbbed through her fractured arm and likely sprained ankle. She tried to haul herself higher, but her strength flagged. Blood trickled from a gash above her temple, and each time she moved, her breath hissed through clenched teeth. The cliff face was all jagged stone and scraggly vegetation, and she knew a single misstep could send her plummeting into the canyon floor, hundreds of feet below. By late afternoon, the sun beat down mercilessly, sapping her remaining energy. Dehydration and shock threatened to drag her into delirium. She forced herself to remain lucid, recalling survival techniques she taught others years ago. Stay still, conserve energy, find shelter. She glanced around and spotted a slightly larger nook beneath a rocky overhang just a few feet to her right. It took 20 agonizing minutes, but she eventually maneuvered herself into that niche, leaning her back against cool stone. Her body trembled with pain, yet this small space provided a fragment of security. As dusk approached, she heard a faint whining sound from above. Scout, she had no idea how the dog had managed to slip away from Bryce and Cassandra, but that telltale whine was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Mustering her strength, she called out, voice raspy, Scout! Scout here, boy. She doubted he could scale down to her position. It was too precarious, but the dog's silhouette soon appeared on the ledge from which she'd fallen. He let out a series of urgent barks, pacing back and forth. Desperation mingled with relief. She whispered to Scout, encouraging him to stay put, to alert anyone who might come. Although she didn't have much hope that hikers would frequent this remote vantage point in the evening, at least she wasn't utterly alone. The dog's presence reminded her that she was still alive, that she wasn't simply a ghost among the rocks. Night eventually draped the canyon in darkness. Temperature dropped rapidly, chilling Margot to the bone. She clutched her arms around herself and tried to keep warm. She'd taught so many novices about layering properly, about how quickly desert canyons get cold. Yet here she was unprepared for an overnight stay. Each breath formed a small plume of vapor. She fought off sleep, certain she might not wake if she surrendered to the beckoning void. Meanwhile, far from the canyon, Bryce and Cassandra were likely spinning their lies. Margot didn't know the details, but she guessed they'd talk about a wonderful Mother's Day trip that ended tragically. Perhaps they'd concoct a story about her wandering off. Or maybe Cassandra, in that pristine, controlled voice, would calmly say they'd last seen Margot heading down a side trail, that they'd waited and waited, then searched but found nothing. The idea of their cold deception churned Margot's stomach. They had planned this. They had intended for her to die out here alone at the bottom of Red Elk Canyon. Morning light eventually returned, and with it came relentless pain in Margot's limbs. She stirred, disoriented by a feverish haze. The gritty taste of dust coated her mouth. Scout's barking reached her ears again. He was still there, bless him, pacing near the drop-off. She called out, voice cracking, "Stay, Scout, I'm here." She tried to think through her next move logically. Waiting around for rescue seemed unlikely. Bryce and Cassandra would not be reporting her fall to anyone. If anything, they'd be working to cover it up. Despite the searing agony in her ankle, she knew she had to attempt to climb, or at least edge her way along the canyon wall. If she could find a sloped path or a smaller drop, she might limp to safety, or at least to a place where someone might find her. She braced her back against the rocky crevice, tested her weight on her good foot, and hissed as pain surged through her fractured arm. Every motion felt like hot knives, but she refused to give in. Inch by excruciating inch, she moved along the narrow shelf. Scout's presence above spurred her on a beacon of loyalty she refused to abandon. The dog's whining grew louder as she drew closer to the ledge where he stood. Once her head came into view, she saw him wagging his tail anxiously, shifting his paws on the rocky ground. With a combination of desperate scrambles and clumsy pulls, Margot finally reached the ledge and collapsed next to Scout. The relief of solid ground under both feet, even though one was badly injured, made her weep. Scout nuzzled her face, whining softly, as if apologizing for not stopping the push. She stroked his fur with her good hand, tears mixing with sweat and blood. "It's okay, boy. It's not your fault." She let herself rest for a few moments, pressing a trembling hand against her chest. The ordeal had left her battered, but she was alive, and that had to mean something. By late morning, Margot mustered enough energy to hobble down a section of the trail that sloped gradually. Scout walked close occasionally, offering a steadying shoulder. It was slow going, each step sending jolts of pain through her body. She needed proper medical attention. Her arm was likely broken in more than one place, and she might have a concussion. Still, she pressed on, guided by decades of outdoor experience and the fierce will to survive. At intervals, she paused to catch her breath, scanning the canyon for signs of other hikers. The longer she went without seeing anyone, the more she realized how remote this spot really was. When she finally heard an engine in the distance, she looked up to see a small helicopter, probably a tourist flight buzzing across the horizon. She waved her uninjured arm, but the chopper droned away. Oblivious sinking against a sun-warmed boulder, she closed her eyes and prayed for a miracle. That miracle came in an unexpected form. As Margot struggled onward, she glimpsed a familiar figure trudging up the trail. Jonah Reese, a man she hadn't seen in years, yet instantly recognized. He had been her late husband's closest army buddy, someone who never quite fit in with civilian life, eventually becoming a park ranger in these very wilds. His gait was steady, purposeful, and when he spotted Margot crumpled against the rock, his expression flickered from shock to urgent concern. "Margot," he called out, voice echoing. She tried to call back, but her throat felt raw. Scout did the work for her, barking until Jonah hurried over. His weather-beaten face twisted with worry as he assessed her injuries, her broken arm, swollen ankle, the blood caked on her temple. He helped her sit upright, offering water from his canteen. The cool liquid was like a benediction on her parched lips. She managed to stammer, "Bryce, Cass." They tried. Jonah's frown deepened as the awful realization dawned. He nodded as if he'd suspected something was off from the start. Margot remembered Jonah's quiet intensity from long ago. He was the sort of man who observed more than he spoke. Without needing further details, he put an arm around her to help her stand. They moved slowly, heading to a small clearing where he'd parked a Ranger ATV hidden behind a copse of pines. While he secured her carefully in the passenger seat, Margot glanced at him through watery eyes. I thought, "I thought I'd die out there," she whispered, voice trembling. Jonah pressed a hand to her shoulder, letting the gesture speak for his empathy. Scout hopped up next to Margot's feet, pressing against her protectively. The engine roared to life and they crawled along the winding ranger trail, heading to Jonah's personal cabin, deep within the park's restricted areas. The world spun around her in a haze. As they arrived, Jonah's cabin was modest. Nothing more than a single room with basic amenities, but it had the advantage of being off the grid. He laid Margot on a cot, fetched a first aid kit, and gently splinted her injured arm and ankle. His hands were surprisingly gentle for a man with soldier's scars. Then he brought her warm soup, urging her to eat. Exhausted, she finally let herself drift into a restless sleep. Scout curled protectively at her side. When she woke, a full day had passed. Jonah, who was seated near a crackling fire, turned to her and asked quietly, "Ready to tell me everything?" And so she did, haltingly through tears, describing the push, the betrayal, the scramble for survival. Jonah listened intently, fists clenched around his canteen. By the time she finished, his jaw was set with determination. He told her to rest, that they'd figure this out together, but first they needed to stay hidden until she was strong enough to move. Margot spent the next few days in Jonah's secluded cabin, where the morning light filtered through cracks in the wooden walls, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Scout's occasional rustle on the floor. Each day brought marginal improvements. Jonah used his old Army medic knowledge to treat her injuries. He fashioned a more secure splint for her arm, wrapped her ankle with a sturdy brace, and monitored her condition for signs of infection. The canyon nights were cold, but Jonah kept the fire going and made sure she had enough blankets. Through feverish bouts of sleep, Margot felt relief that she was among trusted hands. Jonah wasn't the talkative type yet. He made it clear he had no intention of leaving her side until she healed enough to plan their next move. He'd known Bryce since the boy was young, though not well, and had always found him a bit opportunistic, always looking for shortcuts. But Jonah never imagined the situation would devolve into attempted murder. He asked cautious questions about Bryce and Cassandra's motives, and Margot revealed fragments of what she'd overheard in the car before the fateful hike, references to company shares, life insurance, and a mention of a new investor who insisted Bryce have full control of the Lindley Conservation Company. She explained how her late husband had started Lindley Conservation decades ago to protect the local wilderness from developers. When he passed away, Margot inherited a 35% ownership stake, with Bryce also having a share. The rest of the shares were split among longtime employees and stakeholders who believed in preserving the canyon. Despite Bryce's more modern approach bringing in corporate sponsors, Margot's stake allowed her a significant vote in major decisions. Jonah paced the cabin's single room, arms crossed. "So Bryce needed you out of the picture to gain full control?" He said more to himself than to Margot. She nodded, wincing at the pain in her ribs. And Cassandra, she's obviously in on it, possibly the one pushing for it the hardest. Over the next few days, Jonah ventured out discreetly. He brought back items from Margot's house after ensuring nobody was watching. He retrieved her laptop, some documents, and a few changes of clothing. He also discovered that Bryce and Cassandra had started telling neighbors and the local authorities that Margot had wandered off during a hike and was likely lost in the wilderness. A small, half-hearted search party had been organized, but it was quickly called off when no trace was found. It was easy for them to assume Margot at her age might have simply gotten lost. Margot felt a slow-burning anger beneath her grief. She'd taught Bryce to honor nature, to respect life, and yet he'd nearly taken hers in the most callous way. She resolved that she wouldn't simply lie low. She owed it to herself, to her husband's memory, and even to Scout to fight back. She just needed time and Jonah's help to prepare. As Margot's strength returned, Jonah laid out a plan. They would first gather evidence, documenting every shred of proof that Bryce and Cassandra had orchestrated the attempt on Margot's life. Once they had enough to convince the authorities, they'd make a careful move, preferably with a district attorney or law enforcement ally who wouldn't tip off Bryce. Margot feared that her word alone wouldn't be enough. Bryce and Cassandra could simply claim it was an accident. Even a push could be disguised as a misguided attempt to save her from slipping, and they had the upper hand socially and financially. Margot knew that after her disappearance, Bryce would have access to her shares, maybe even forging paperwork to prove it. She told Jonah about the times Bryce had asked her to sign seemingly harmless documents. She'd read them carefully then, but who knew what else he might have slipped into her records? That prompted Jonah to take a closer look at Margot's personal files. She'd kept them in a locked filing cabinet at home, rarely checking them beyond basic bookkeeping. Jonah was no stranger to infiltration tactics. He'd done intelligence work in the Army. While Margot rested, Jonah drove to her cabin under the cover of darkness, disabling the motion sensor lights in the driveway. Inside, he carefully removed all the relevant company documents, placing them in sealed envelopes. Scout guarded the cabin door, ears perked at the slightest rustle. As Jonah worked methodically, he found more than he expected. Unusual disclaimers hidden among corporate forms, suspicious amendments that bore signatures suspiciously like Margot's, one form labeled Living Will and Share Transfer Agreement, left Jonah's stomach twisting in knots. It declared that Margot willingly transferred her portion of the Lindley Conservation Company to Bryce effective upon her incapacitation or confirmed death. The date on the document was just a week prior. Returning to the remote cabin, Jonah showed Margot the evidence. Her face paled at the sight of her forged signature. There was also a clause about Cassandra being a co-beneficiary, which meant she would profit directly from Margot's presumed death. Margot felt sick with betrayal. She recalled how Cassandra had once praised the conservation spirit, but apparently that was all a performance. She clenched her teeth, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. They needed more than just the fake documents. Jonah had an idea if they could get Bryce or Cassandra to incriminate themselves verbally, maybe through a recorded conversation, or by rummaging through their private data, they'd have a solid case. Jonah admitted he had certain hacking skills from his old days skills he didn't advertise. With Margot's permission, he delved into Bryce's cloud storage, determined to see if there were digital breadcrumbs. The next days were tense. While Margot sat with her ankle propped up, relacing her arm splint, or stroking Scout's fur for comfort, Jonah hunched over her laptop. The glow from the screen lit his face in the dim cabin, and occasionally he'd mutter under his breath about encryption or file paths. Finally, Jonah struck gold. Late one evening, he exhaled sharply as he opened a hidden folder in Bryce's cloud account. It contained a series of photographs labeled with dates leading up to Mother's Day. Some images showed the Red Elk overlook from various angles with Bryce's typed notes. Check stability of ledge, possible vantage points, timing for best light. Reading them felt like glimpsing a murderer's blueprint. There were also text messages, screen captures between Bryce and Cassandra. The conversation was chilling Cassandra. She won't feel a thing if we do it quick. We just need to make sure no one sees. Bryce, I'll distract her. You handle the drone. Afterward, we post the final picture. Cassandra. We can say she loved the canyon so much, she decided to go for a walk alone. Margot's stomach churned. Each line was another nail in Bryce and Cassandra's coffin, indisputable proof of premeditation. But perhaps the most damning file was a video snippet they had recorded as a test run. It showed Cassandra holding the camera coaching Bryce on how to instruct Margot to move back a little more. His voice in the video was calm, almost casual, as if practicing a line for a play. The video ended abruptly with Cassandra smirking at the lens stating, "Just think by tomorrow, this is all ours." Jonah backed up the files on multiple USB drives and encrypted them on cloud services he trusted. They now had enough to implicate Bryce and Cassandra for conspiracy and attempted murder. However, Jonah also wanted an actual confession or a confrontation that would allow law enforcement to see the truth firsthand. Margot was wary. Confrontation sounded dangerous. She knew Bryce had already shown he was capable of violence. But Jonah reasoned that with the right setup, they could corner the couple in front of witnesses and law enforcement, leaving no room for escape. Outside the cabin, birds trilled in the crisp morning air. Scout perked up at the sound of a deer passing through the brush. Margot gave Jonah a half smile. "You're risking a lot for me," she said softly. Jonah shrugged, eyes distant. "Your husband saved my life once long ago. Consider this me returning the favor. Besides," he added, "you're the only real family I've got left." They decided to bring the district attorney into the loop. Jonah had a contact, an old friend from his Intel days, who now worked in the legal system. If they could coordinate a sting operation, they might reveal Bryce's scheme at the corporate board meeting where Bryce was presumably planning to solidify his takeover. Margot could imagine the scenario, a routine meeting to confirm the transfer of shares, a room full of board members, and suddenly, the truth. But how to ensure Bryce and Cassandra showed up unaware? That would be the tricky part. Jonah's strategy leak, a rumor that Margot's shares needed official ratification, even if she were missing Bryce lusting after formal recognition as the new chairperson, would come eagerly Cassandra too, and that would be the moment they'd watch their carefully constructed lies fall apart. While Margot continued her recovery, Jonah made discreet moves in the background. He tapped into old connections to quietly reach out to a district attorney who specialized in fraud and conspiracy cases. Because of Margot's injuries, they also needed an official medical report, but it had to be obtained without tipping Bryce off. Jonah arranged for a trusted nurse, another friend from his service days, to visit the cabin to document Margot's condition and treat her wounds more thoroughly. It wasn't a full hospital exam, but it would bolster their case that she'd endured a violent attempt on her life. In the meantime, Margot wrestled with conflicting emotions. She had never imagined such depth of betrayal from her own child. She remembered the bright-eyed boy who once proudly handed her a bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked in that same canyon. Now she had to remind herself that this man was capable of murder. Perhaps the memory of that sweet boy was just a ghost overshadowed by the greed that had grown inside Bryce as the years went by. She cycled through sadness, anger, and a fierce resolve to see justice done. Cassandra's involvement weighed heavily on her mind, too. She recalled how the woman had once gazed over Margot's old photo albums with feigned interest, praising Bryce's upbringing in the wilderness. Had Cassandra's affection been an act from the very start, part of a calculated plan to gain power and control? The text messages and video made it clear that Cassandra was anything but an innocent bystander. Jonah worked late into the evenings coordinating the final steps of the sting. He set up hidden cameras in Margot's house and yard, tiny devices he placed in innocuous spots, like a flower vase or under the eaves. He reasoned that Bryce and Cassandra might return to rummage for additional papers or personal belongings. If so, they could capture further incriminating footage. One night, as they ate a simple meal of canned stew, Jonah told Margot what he'd discovered on social media. Bryce and Cassandra had posted a tearful tribute to Margot, featuring the last photo they took of her. The post read, "In loving memory of the best mom we could ever hope for. Lost but never forgotten. Mother's Day, hike, sash missing, in spirit." It had already garnered hundreds of sympathetic comments. Margot felt ill scrolling through the post on Jonah's phone, reading condolence messages from people who believed she was dead. Some praised Bryce's courage for continuing his mother's legacy. Margot's eyes stung with tears but also fury. "How dare they exploit me like this?" she whispered. "They're posing as the grieving family, lapping up sympathy, while plotting to take everything I hold dear." Jonah placed a comforting hand over hers. "We'll see how sympathetic people are once the truth comes out," he assured her. "And believe me, Margot, the truth will come out in a big way." By the time Margot was able to walk with crutches, her ankle still tender, and her arm in a sturdy cast, Jonah deemed her well enough for the final act. The board meeting at Lindley Conservation Company was scheduled for the following week, conveniently timed so that Bryce could make his official bid for the chairperson's seat. According to Jonah's district attorney contact, there would be a special announcement about Margot's shares. Bryce and Cassandra were expected to attend, especially since they believed they had everything set up in their favor. On the morning of the meeting, Margot gazed at herself in Jonah's small mirror. Bruises still mottled her skin, and exhaustion shadowed her eyes, but a fierce determination burned within. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, practical clothing that allowed her to move without too much discomfort. Scout whined at her side, as if sensing the magnitude of what was about to happen. They drove into the city and Jonah's old truck windows rolled down. Margot inhaled deeply, feeling the rush of both fear and anticipation. Jonah had arranged for police backup to be stationed in unmarked cars outside the Lindley Conservation headquarters. The district attorney herself would be inside posing as a silent observer in the boardroom, waiting for the moment to expose Bryce's treachery. Margot found herself trembling, though she held her chin high. This was the confrontation that would define her future and possibly end with Bryce's arrest. The headquarters was a modern building of steel and glass, a stark contrast to the rustic canyon Margot loved. They slipped in through a side entrance. Jonah accompanied her to a small waiting room adjacent to the main boardroom where they could listen without being seen. The plan was to let Bryce begin his presentation so he'd reveal his forged documents and assert his position as the new chair. Then, when the moment was right, Margot would appear very much alive and ready to show the real evidence. Behind the closed doors, Bryce's voice boomed with a confident politeness that made Margot's stomach turn. He stood at the head of a long mahogany table, addressing the board members. Cassandra was seated beside him, flipping through a binder of papers. Thank you all for gathering today to discuss the future of Lindley conservation. Bryce began. As you know, my mother, Margot Lindley, is sadly presumed lost to a tragic accident. We, her family, have done everything we can to find her. But the authorities have... He paused, voice cracking with false grief. Cassandra patted his arm sympathetically. It's been a devastating loss, she added. Margot cared so much about this company, and we honor her legacy by proceeding with her wishes. With that, Bryce pressed a button on a sleek laptop, and the projector cast onto the wall. A slide titled Share Transfer and Succession appeared, followed by the forged documents bearing Margot's signature. Margot clenched her fists around the crutches, heart pounding. Next to her, Jonah nodded once. The time had come. A hush fell across the boardroom as the final slides displayed. Bryce cleared his throat. These documents, as you can see, detail Margot's intention to transfer her 35% stake to me upon her unfortunate demise or incapacitation. The majority of you have worked alongside my mother for years, so you know how devoted she was to protecting this canyon. I promise to uphold those values moving forward with Cassandra's support. One of the board members, an older woman named Helen, who had been Margot's friend since the company's founding, spoke up in a trembling voice. Bryce, do we have any formal confirmation of Margot's? She couldn't bring herself to say the word death. Bryce forced a somber nod. The authorities have concluded that it's unlikely she survived. While we continue to pray for a miracle, the passage of time and the circumstances of her disappearance indicate we must move on. That was the cue Jonah had been waiting for. He signaled to the district attorney, who discreetly tapped a hidden control. The projector screen flickered and the carefully prepared slideshow vanished. In its place appeared a new video file. Bryce froze, confusion flooding his face. Cassandra leaned forward, lips parted in alarm. The screen now showed raw footage of their planning from Bryce's own cloud account. Cassandra adjusting the camera lens, Bryce practicing the lines about a little closer. Perfect. Another clip revealed Cassandra's blunt statement. She won't feel a thing. It'll be quick. Gasps rippled through the boardroom. Helen clasped her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. Another board member stood abruptly, looking at Bryce in shock. Bryce fumbled with the laptop, trying to shut off the playback, but it continued. A hush blanketed the room as the final image froze, Cassandra smirking at the camera, whispering, "Think about the money. Think about what we can do once she's out of the picture." The door to the waiting room opened and Margot emerged on her crutches, escorted by Jonah and Scout. A stunned silence consumed the air. Some board members gasped. Others stood in disbelief. Bryce looked as though he'd seen a ghost face draining of color. Cassandra recoiled, letting out a breathy exclamation. Margot squared her shoulders, voice resonating in the silent boardroom. You wanted me gone. You thought I'd never come back to tell the truth. But here I am. A wave of conflicting emotions swept her: anger, heartbreak, betrayal. But she channeled it into her unwavering tone. You both took advantage of my love. You orchestrated a plan to murder your own mother for shares and profit. And you nearly succeeded, Bryce stuttered. Mom, I don't know how this is all some kind of misunderstanding. That video is out of context. He was backing away, eyes darting toward the exits. Cassandra's hand flew to her mouth, panic contorting her features. She slowly realized there were law enforcement officers in plain clothes stationed by the door, blocking any escape. The district attorney rose from a seat in the corner, flashing her badge with calm authority. Bryce Lindley, Cassandra Lindley. Under suspicion of conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud. We have evidence substantiating these charges. Please step away from the table. Police officers moved in hands on holsters. Cassandra shrieked, leaping to her feet, but an officer intercepted her. Scout, sensing danger, let out a low growl. Amid the clamor, Bryce kept trying to spin excuses. Mom, you have to believe me. It was an accident, Cassandra tell them. But Cassandra glared at him, tears mixing with fury. It was all your idea, she hissed, voice breaking. She twisted away from the officer as if searching for an exit, but the officers formed a tight ring around both of them. It was over. Their elaborate facade lay shattered, exposed by their own incriminating files. Helen, tears in her eyes, rushed to Margot's side. Oh, Margot, we all thought. She choked on her words. Margot closed her eyes for a moment, relief flooding her that she could see old friends again, alive, not disappeared into the canyon's depths. She pressed a hand against Helen's shoulder. I know, Margot murmured. I'm sorry for the shock. She looked around at the board members, many of whom had known her family for years. Some were pale, trembling at the realization that the cherished son had tried to kill his mother. Let this be a lesson, Margot said, her voice quiet but resonant, that evil can wear a familiar face. Jonah stepped forward quietly, confirming details with the district attorney. Margot watched as Bryce and Cassandra were read their rights, handcuffed, and led away. Bryce's eyes pleaded with her one last time, though no words formed on his lips. Cassandra kept her face lowered as if she couldn't bear to look anyone in the eye. Margot felt a pang, an echo of maternal love colliding with the horrifying truth, but she knew justice had to be served. As the commotion settled, the board members rallied around Margot, assisting her to a chair. She exhaled shakily, adrenaline still coursing through her. I'm so sorry to bring such chaos here, she said, but I needed you all to see the truth with your own eyes. A hush lingered before the room erupted in comfort and relief, a wave of support that momentarily soothed Margot's battered spirit. At the back of the room, Scout sat calmly, tail wagging at the sight of Margot, safe and surrounded by allies. Jonah gave a subtle nod to Margot, his expression a mixture of pride and relief. In that moment, she felt profound gratitude to him, to the district attorney, to every piece of evidence that kept her alive to tell this tale. She brushed away tears, letting out a breath that felt like she'd been holding it for years. The legal process moved swiftly in the days that followed. Bryce and Cassandra were held without bail. Given the seriousness of the charges and the mountain of evidence against them, Margot provided detailed testimony supported by Jonah and the trove of digital files they'd uncovered. The forged living will, the text messages, the planning videos. Every piece condemned Bryce's assertion that it was a simple accident. Though the outcome seemed certain, Margot still experienced waves of emotional turmoil. Late at night in the solace of her cabin, she'd find herself dwelling on moments of Bryce's childhood, teaching him how to skip stones, laughing at his corny jokes, or tucking him into bed when he had nightmares. How had that sweet boy grown into a man capable of pushing his own mother off a cliff? Some nights she cried softly and without shame for what was lost. Public reaction to the story was intense. Local news outlets featured headlines like Mother's Day Horror Son Charged with Attempted Murder. A few tabloids sensationalized the story further, labeling Cassandra a black widow who manipulated Bryce for financial gain. In the face of this media storm, Margot gave only one brief public statement filmed outside the courthouse. "I trusted my son," she said. Voice steady. "He broke that trust in the worst way. But I survived thanks to good people and a loyal friend. Let this serve as a reminder that truth and justice prevail." She then retreated back to her own life, seeking the tranquility of her cabin. It wasn't an easy return. Each step on her crutch reminded her of the canyon's harrowing ledge. But Jonah visited often, helping with groceries and repairs, ensuring she didn't overstrain her healing body. He was there the day Margot burned the fake share transfer document in her old fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the forged signature. "Good riddance," Jonah muttered, tossing in the last corner of the paper. Margot nodded, tears in her eyes, but her shoulders squared as if shedding a heavy weight she'd carried far too long. Within Lindley Conservation, the board acted quickly to restore Margot's official stake, repudiating any documents Bryce had introduced. They also convened an emergency vote to maintain the company's mission, ensuring that the conservation efforts would remain intact. A few weeks later, Margot attended a quiet ceremony where they honored her late husband's vision, reaffirming her position on the board as a major shareholder. Helen embraced her, tightly whispering words of kindness about how they'd do everything in their power to uphold the canyon's protection. At the end of that day, Margot walked the trails behind her cabin, with Scout limping alongside her. She paused by a small overlook, gazing out at the endless red rock vistas. For the first time in weeks, she felt a stirring of peace. The memory of Bryce's betrayal would never vanish, but she found a sense of solace in knowing that life still held promise, that the canyon, timeless in its grandeur, had welcomed her back as a survivor, not a victim. Months passed, and Margot's cast came off. Though her arm and ankle still ached on cold mornings, she refused to be caged by old fears. She resumed gentle hikes, leaning on a trekking pole for balance. Scout ever by her side, Jonah became a frequent visitor, sometimes arriving with fresh groceries or homemade soup, other times just to chat on the porch while the evening sun dipped below the pines. Bryce and Cassandra's trial loomed. The evidence was stacked in the prosecution's favor, and the pair faced multiple felony counts. Margot opted not to attend every hearing. It was painful enough to see her son in that predicament, even if he deserved it. But on the final day, when verdicts were read, she arrived with Jonah. The courtroom was tense with the weight of the proceedings. Bryce looked hollow, his once confident demeanor replaced by a haunted stare. Cassandra maintained a stony exterior. The jury found them both guilty of attempted murder conspiracy to commit fraud and forgery. Sentencing would come later, but Margot knew they'd be facing prison time. A swirl of conflicting emotions coursed through her relief. Sorrow, anger. She refused to meet Bryce's eyes instead, focusing on the judge's firm tone as she pronounced their fate. Afterward, outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Margot offered only a brief, measured speech, echoing the vow she'd made at the hospital. "They told me to smile for one last photo," she said, looking directly into the cameras. "I will, but this time it's on my terms." Then she turned away, refusing further comment. Jonah shielded her from the press, guiding her to the sanctuary of his old truck. Scout sat in the back tail, thumping anxiously. Life found a new equilibrium after the trial. Margot spent her days in quiet reflection, working with the Lindley Conservation Board to plan expanded projects that honored her husband's mission to protect Red Elk Canyon. She also compiled her photographs, some battered from her near-fatal fall, into a new scrapbook, one that didn't shy away from the painful chapter she'd survived. On the mantel of her cabin, she placed the infamous Mother's Day photo, a moment in time, forever tied to betrayal. Yet now she kept it as a symbol of resilience, having cropped out the canyon edge, so all that remained was her own determined face. One evening, seated by the fireplace, Margot gently placed her old camera next to the scrapbook. Scout rested his chin on her knee, as if to say everything was all right. She thought back to the last words she spoke in the boardroom. He gave me a push, but he didn't know I still had one shot left in me. A quiet smile curled her lips. She had survived the unthinkable, reclaimed her life, and ensured that justice was served. She gazed into the flickering flames, letting the warmth remind her of the unwavering spirit that guided her through the canyon's darkest hours. This Mother's Day, she understood more than ever that family was not always defined by blood. Real family stood beside you when you fell, and sometimes they were the ones who made sure you rose again. Thank you for sharing this fireside moment with me today. Margot's harrowing journey from betrayal to triumph reminds us that sometimes our greatest strength emerges when we're pushed to the edge, and that a mother's intuition is rarely wrong. If Margot's story resonated with you, please take a moment to subscribe and tap that notification bell. Your support doesn't just help our fireside community grow, it tells me which stories touch your hearts most deeply. Now, I'm curious, were you expecting that twist with the GPS tracker in her wedding ring? Would you have forgiven Bryce, or was Margot right to press charges? Share your thoughts below and let me know which corner of the world you're cozying up in tonight. Next week, we'll explore another tale of unexpected courage when a midnight ferry crossing becomes a race against time for twin sisters separated by fate. You won't want to miss it. Until we meet again by these flames, remember the most powerful stories aren't just told, they're lived. This is Emma Rose keeping the fire burning for you at her Fireside Stories.